Welcome to part 3 of 80s Marathon.
It's the 80s.
I'm your host with the most, Henry R. Mockingbird. Salutations.
I'm Gary.
You're probably wondering why I'm doing in this costume. Well, viewers, it's because today me and Gary are going to review The Dark Crystal, considering Dark Crystal Age of Resistance just came out today. Well, let's stop wasting time and get to the review. The Dark Crystal is about a gelfling named Ken who was raised by the Mystics when he was orphaned. Now he must go on a quest. On his quest, he meets another gelfling, Kira. They join forces together to save their world from the Skeksis. What do I think of this show? Well, I think Dark Crystal is one of the greatest movies of all time. In case you didn't know, I'm a huge fan of Jim Henson and the Muppets and his work. First, let's talk about the characters. First, there's Jim, who it's kind of his story about his growth, and he ends up falling in love with Kira, the other gelfling. Kira is kind and sweet and has a good spirit. Then there are the Mystics and the Skeksis. Skeksis and the Mystics are linked. The Mystics feel whatever the Skeksis feel, and vice versa. Kind of like E.T. The difference being the Mystics are mostly wise and mystical, while the Skeksis are mostly dark and cruel. My favorite of the Skeksis is the Chamberlain. I just love his whimper. A lot of people like to say the Skeksis are creepy, but to be honest, they didn't creep me out that much. The ones that did creep me out were the Garthans. These things are the things of nightmares.
You ain't kidding, and I thought Kingdom of the Spiders made my feathers curl.
Originally, the Skeksis were going to speak in a language that Jim Henson had specifically written just for the movie. And the language was going to have subtitles. But after several unsuccessful screenings, the idea was dropped and they decided just to have the Skeksis speak English. Gag is as loyal as a dog, but his bark can be rather annoying.
Oh, shut up!
The Podlings are also pretty good side characters. I kind of feel bad when they have to be converted into slaves. And then there's Algra, who's a wise old hermit. Jim Henson got the idea for Dark Crystal when he was looking at a book by Lewis Carroll, who also wrote Alice in Wonderland. The book was called Pig's Tale. He was looking at illustrations where some animals were wearing robes and jewelry, and a crocodile and a Victorian bathtub. Another influence for Dark Crystal was the Land of Grunge, which was shown on Saturday Night Live. Jim Henson didn't want the Dark Crystal to have a Muppet-like look. He wanted to give the creatures a three-dimensional look. After looking at an illustration from Brian Froud, who also designed all the creatures in the movie, Jim Henson was hooked on Brian Froud, If you would like to know how the effects were done, I'm not really going to tell you because I have a whole video on that. But if you would like to see that video, I'll leave a link in the description below. I won't go over every detail on how the effects were done, like I said. They're mostly puppets and animatronics, and are very impressive and top-notch. And up until the time it was made, effects like these weren't really done this elaborately.
Impressive. Most impressive.
Dark Crystal has become a cult classic. What is a cult film, you're probably wondering? Well, in case you don't know what a cult film is, a cult film can mean everything to big budget wannabe blockbusters that were box office bombs when they first came out, but managed to gain a following, to movies that are just so bad they're good, and they pretty much only have a cult following just for how bad they are.
They're eating her! And then they're going to eat me! Oh my God!
Okay, moving on, shall we? One of the producers of Dark Crystal, besides Jim Henson, was Gary Kurtz, who also was one of the producers of Star Wars.
You'll be malfunctioning within a day, you nearsighted scrap pile.
Gary Kurtz was also one of the producers behind Empire Strikes Back. One of the executive producers was Frank Oz, who also puppeteered Yoda. Jim Henson, Brian Froud, and everybody who worked on The Dark Crystal would later go to work on another movie called Labyrinth. Labyrinth had a much lighter tone than Dark Crystal did, and yes, me and Gary do plan to do Labyrinth sometime down the road. The Dark Crystal movie does have a bit of a Grimm Brothers fairy tale-like atmosphere to it. The Dark Crystal was filmed in Elstree Studios in England, the same place where the Star Wars trilogy was filmed. The music in this movie is also pretty good, especially the theme music. It has very much a mythical and magical quality to it. Another song, The Podling Dance, is also pretty good. This Podling song was also used in Stranger Things Season 3. The song that Kira sings is very beautiful. Listen. I talked about most of the ups of the film. What are the downs of the film? Well, there are two. The one flaw with this film is that it opens rather slowly, but it does pick up. And remember when I said that this film was a cult classic? Well, there's a bit of a story behind that. Allow me to explain. Dark Crystal wasn't very successful when it first came out. That was mostly for the fact that it was overshadowed by E.T. Dark Crystal wasn't the only film that was overshadowed by E.T. There was also Secret of NIMH, Tron, and even The Thing. It didn't really help matters none that critics took the film unkindly and that audiences were mostly confused by the film. But over time, it managed to find its audience. That's pretty much all I have to say about Dark Crystal. But we have some bad news. We're going to have to postpone the finale of 80s Marathon, which was going to be the Ghostbusters in 1984. So, until then, I'll see you in the next review. This is Henry R. Mockingbird, signing off. I give the film 5 stars. Do not forget to comment down below, push like and subscribe, and ring bell for new contact. If you'd like to request an old school movie on this show, please do so by requesting it in the comments.